Annalie hadn't even bothered to glare at her cousin when she insinuated the matrimonial possibilities of Mr. Scott with her endless questions about the newcomer. Coretta was always trying to match her with someone, however unlikely the pairing seemed. Annalie had instead given straightforward answers as though she didn't see what the older girl was doing. She had known him since Saturday. No, she didn't know where he was from, but yes, he probably had to defy his family to remain with the Union. Yes, it was sad that he'd lost his leg. No, she didn't know how he'd lost it, or what he had planned for his life. No, Papa hadn't introduced him to the town at church yesterday. She didn't know why they'd waited for today. And so it went until Coretta had exhausted the subject and left Annalie at the door of the mercantile. In the 10 years Annalie had been coming to town with the money Papa allowed her each week, Uncle Harry had never failed her. Today was no exception. When none of the yellows he had in stock quite suited Annalie's vision, he pulled from behind the counter a sample box of special order thread that held exactly the color she wanted. After taking her order for 5 of the number 10 yellows, he gave his sample to her. A special discount, he said, and winked at her. Had she not been wearing her bonnet, he might have tousled her hair as he had done when she was a girl, for to Uncle Harry's mind she would always be the little tag-along who let her brother do all the talking, while she stared at the pretty sugar candies behind the glass. Then Mr. Scott and Papa came out of the back room that Uncle Harry rented out to the tailor, Mr. Loudon, who had been taking the young man's measurements for a new suit of clothes. Annalie left the men at the counter to start sifting through the bolts of fabric arranged on shelves against the opposite wall. Fine silks for special garments, heavy poplins for cold weather, calicoes for every day. Any fabric she could think of wanting, Uncle Harry had. He was not lacking color either. Annalie felt sure she would get a headache if she looked at the shelves too long, with their greens and reds and yellows, and almost whatever other colors she cared to name. She could tell the patterns of the various prints from the sides of most of the bolts, but pieces of fabric that had not been properly wound draped from some bolts onto the ones under them. Annalie started lifting these errant pieces to see the hidden ones, and finally came to a light muslin of pale lavender that would be ideal for a summer dress. She lifted the muslin out of its stack, but stopped when she saw what its loose edge had been hiding. A plain black calico. Annalie would need a new morning dress when Rebecca passed. The black began to bleed into the colors surrounding it as her vision blurred. Annalie squinted her left eye at the feeling of dust collecting in the tier there, and then, with a fierce abruptness she hadn't intended, she finished yanking the bolt of lavender muslin off the shelf to let the other bolts of fabric slam back into place over the calico. The edge of a green muslin fluttered in the breeze from the crash and recovered the fabric. She allowed herself a few calming breaths, blinked the haze from her eyes, and then assumed the devil-may-care arch in her right eyebrow that her brother had been so disposed to sport. She'd wondered on occasion if it had been a natural look or one that he, too, had needed to feign. It was one of the many questions she wished she had asked him. Uncle Harry had just finished filling the order for the material for Mr. Scott's suit when Annalie brought her bolt of fabric to the counter. "Might I have 12 yards to go with my new thread, please?" "I do love when you come in with your papa, Annalie. I can always depend on you to have a new masterpiece in mind." "It doesn't hurt that these masterpieces add a nice sum to the till," Papa told Mr. Scott. "Now, Nathan, you know that with a daughter getting married, pecuniary concerns weigh on my mind a bit more than they used to." "I didn't think it was possible," Papa teased, and Uncle Harry laughed. It was common knowledge in Newkirk that the only reason he had so much business was that people could trust him to give a line of credit to even the poorest of farmers if he knew they'd fallen on hard times, his faith in the basic goodness of folks having come to him some 20 years earlier when he'd gotten a nice long talking to from his future brother-in-law. "That does remind me there's a matter about the wedding I'd like to discuss with you when you have a moment," Papa said, and then held up a hand to ward off the automatic refusal of charity that the look on Uncle Harry's face said was coming. "Yes, it's about a gift, but it's nothing too extravagant, I promise." "Nathan, your notion of extravagance is a mite different than most people's, but I suppose I'll hear you out." Uncle Harry finished measuring and cutting the fabric before leading Papa into his office, where Annalee knew he would argue against whatever Papa was proposing, just as he knew he would relent to Papa's persuasion. "He's probably going to offer to pay for the whole thing," Mr. Scott commented as he watched the two older men leave. "Or else build and furnish a new house for them," Annalee laughed. "You must have gotten to know Papa pretty well in the hospital." "A little." "And it seems he has you figured as well. He was right, you do have a gift with horses. Thank you for helping." "You would have managed him in a moment. He knows you and trusts your voice. I was merely incidental." "I'd call that false modesty, but I somehow doubt you would be false about anything. Thank you in any case." "You're welcome." "I do wonder, though," Annalee continued as she fingered a piece of lace that might just suit a lady's handkerchief if she thought about it, "why you weren't in a cavalry unit with your talent, incidental or otherwise." Mr. Scott seemed puzzled that she should mention such a topic, so she hastened to add, "I only ask because Coretta and I were just discussing it, and she made me realize I know next to nothing about you." "Well, we are almost strangers." "Oh, I know." Why had it been so much easier for Tom to make conversation without sounding imbecilic? Mr. Scott must have had a confirmed opinion of her as a trivial chatterbox a minute after she opened her mouth. "I just didn't think it right to take an animal into a fight he had no part in starting," Mr. Scott said. At least he was answering her question. "Tom was of the opinion that the more horses on the field the better. Then perhaps someone there would have the sense God gave a horse." Mr. Scott laughed, the first such sound Annalee had heard from him since his arrival. "I expect I would have liked your brother." "You would have." Everyone had. Annalee smoothed out the lace she had been admiring and tried to think of what she should say next. Mr. Scott didn't seem interested in starting a new subject. She wouldn't be either, if she thought she were at a prattler's mercy. "I like Newkirk in general," he said at last. "The people seem friendly." "Oh, they are." Annalee smiled. Finally, here was something she could discuss without any fear of offense. "The Brightons, the ones with the colt, they're the most pleasant people one could hope to know. Don't make them angry, though. Frightful tempers, but to their credit not easily roused. And then there are the Etheridge boys. Men, really, but I grew up with them, so I'm probably doomed to always think of them as 12-year-olds. But you're a college man, so you'll probably like Mr. Moore best. He's the only person around here who's been to college, besides John and Papa. Mind you, he's a great one to debate, but you seem a decent enough fellow, and not especially quarrelsome, so I imagine it would stay friendly. The only problem is he travels so much. He leaves for Fairmont tomorrow, so you ought to meet him today. He's an itinerant preacher, you see. He got the idea from the Methodists, who actually got it from Paul, but he's not a Methodist. I don't know what he is, really." "I don't think we'll have time to call on him today," Mr. Scott interrupted. "Surely you will. He would so enjoy speaking with you." "I'm sure he would." Annalee couldn't possibly have missed the sarcasm in Mr. Scott's tone. "If there's some denominational quarrel, I'm certain—" "My quarrel isn't with the church." She held her new-bought fabric close to her chest as though it could hide her. "I've offended you. It was not my intention. I'm sorry. My trouble has always been saying either nothing at all or entirely too much. If it happens again, feel free to walk away and leave me spouting nonsense to myself." Annalee followed Mr. Scott's gaze to the floor, where the missing leg told her she had probably just offended him again at the suggestion to walk away. "You haven't offended me. I'm just—" he sighed. "I'm more quarrelsome than you know. I was rude. I apologize." She offered her hand. "We'll be friends then, shall we, Mr. Scott?" He shook her hand. "On one condition. Mr. Scott is my father. I'm just Teague." "And I shall be just Annalee. Whether mute or chattering will depend on my presence of mind and your tolerance. But beware, I can't promise I won't offend you again." His smile became very like the one Tom had always given just before making a joke at her expense. But instead of such a comment, Teague said simply, if somewhat wryly, "I thought not." Wednesday, 8 August 1855. Father took Henry to town today to be sold without even telling me, though I might have expected it. He discovered Henry and Nancy's secret last night coming back from tending to Peppa's new foal. He dragged Henry to the whipping post with Nancy close behind, pleading with him to give her the lashes instead. The commotion drew the others out too, as I ran from the house to where Father was tying Henry. A group of them were gathering several paces off. I joined in Nancy's pleading. Father turned to me to ask if I had known about this, and struck me when I told him I had been there when the abolitionist preacher married them. He made Webb and George hold Nancy and me back as he beat Henry himself. He kept yelling with every stroke of the lash about how Nancy was meant for Mr. Hopkins' Josh, and how much this was going to cost him. I finally got Webb to let me loose, and jerked the lash out of Father's hand. We stood there in silence for a moment. He was breathing hard and staring at me. I pointed at Henry's back, which shone with sweat and blood in the light of the house. "That's enough," I said. He stared at me a moment longer, and I thought perhaps he was frightened of me. Then he took the lash from me and went into the house without a word. I sat down on the ground and took what seemed the first breath since I had come outside. George helped Henry to his cabin, and the others followed. Webb knelt beside me for a moment and patted my arm, then walked toward Henry's cabin. I looked toward the house and saw Will watching me from his window. I only hope he had just gotten there and had not seen what had happened. God help us.